Our next presenter is Dr. Richard Meadow, the director of the Zoo Archaeology Lab in the Peabody Museum and senior lecturer in the department. He is also currently serving as the director of undergraduate studies in anthropology and the chair of the FAS Standing Committee on Archaeology. His research focuses on understanding human behavior in the past, with a particular concern for Southern Asia, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, as seen through the lens of animal remains from archaeological sites. And today we're going to hear him talk a little bit about the work they've been doing on buffalo and zebu in South Asia.
Thank you very much, Rowan. It's a great pleasure to speak to everyone today at Anthropology Afternoon. All of the previous speakers have had a significant historical component to their presentations. However short that historical component may be as far as the time concerned. My historical component is going to be much longer, perhaps go back 8,000 or more years. But at the same time, what I'm talking about is still I'm talking about people, talking about human behavior, although I'm looking at human behavior through a different lens, and that is through the lens of two other forms of vertebrates, water buffalo and a particular type of cattle, the zebu cattle or the Bos indicus, which is particularly typical, known from South Asia. All work which goes on in archaeology these days is based on teamwork. No one has enough time or capability to become conversant with all the different things one needs to do today to be an archaeologist and to understand the multi-dimensional aspects of the past and the different techniques which are required now to illuminate those different perspectives. This image shows three members of the team which I've been working with, a total of four, along with a local archaeologist in the archaeological workstation outside of the airport near Xi'an. This is Ajita Patel, who's worked for me for many years and is an excellent zooarchaeologist. This is Professor Li Lu, now at Stanford University, who was, I helped to supervise her PhD dissertation here at Harvard when she was a student of Professor Kwang-Chi Chung. And this is her, our colleague from the Institute of Archaeology in Beijing, Chen Chen Sang, who is now, I guess, a deputy director of that institute. What you see in front of them are skulls of very large cattle, which were recovered from the gravels of out in Shaanxi and in Henan province in northern China. These are skulls from wild cattle, and they are the type of wild cattle which is not a zebu cattle. It's a non-humped cattle, and we'll talk about that issue in a couple of minutes. So the characters involved here are the water buffalo. Thanks to the Wall Street Journal for this wonderful image. Not a place you'd expect to find something like that, but it is a wonderful image. These are potentially very ferocious animals. A group of them chased my sister through the streets of a town in northern India while she was riding with a friend of hers on a motorbike. They can be rather fierce, but as you can say, they have their soft sides as well. And we'll see some more of that in a minute. And then you have the zebu cattle, which you can see here in different configurations. The upper left, highly decorated for ceremonial purposes, with their very sophisticated horns, which actually have been trained to have that particular shape, as well as just some leaner animals over there on the upper right, and then some animals plowing. You can see quite distinctly the different morphologies of the skull and of the body of these different animals, representing the diversity of different forms and different activities which these animals are dedicated to, ceremonial as well as practical. Now, these cattle obviously had ancestors, and they basically, through their increasing interaction with humans and human selection on these animals through isolating them from their wild relatives, became domestic. This image shows you the presumed distribution of cattle across the southern portion of Eurasia and North Africa. I should state at the beginning that there are today no extant wild cattle anymore. The last wild cow was that we know historically was killed in the Białowieża forest in 1617 in Poland. The last documented one. There may, until fairly more recently, have been some forms of wild cattle here in Southeast Asia in the Golden Triangle area, basically, which was basically they were protected there just because there were extremely dense forest areas, but there haven't been recent sightings of those animals. The Zebu Bos indicus is confined primarily, its ancestry seems to have been primarily to the South Asian area. To what degree it may have gone into Southeast Asia is unknown. There is another form, which is the taurine or flatback cattle, which covers the other areas in purple. And then you have the African forms, which there's still a lot of debate about, but they seem to be more recent descendants of wild forms of the European form, which ended up in North Africa. Genetically, these forms are distinct. This has been a major contribution to archaeology today, both in human studies and in animal studies, and that is the use of genetics, both modern, looking at modern populations as well as to the degree possible, using ancient DNA to characterize the remains from ancient animals. This cluster graph, which you see up at the top here, indicates the distinctiveness of the Bos indicus from the forms of Bos taurus. And you see here the Bos primigenius, that is the extinct wild form, which is also seems to be separate from these. The problem with that is that all the Bos indicus material, which is from ancient DNA, comes from Europe, and we know now that the European form actually had a distinct was a distinct form from that of Western Asia, and that the forms that you see now in Africa, not so much in Africa, but in Europe and in the Near East, basically are much more closely related to our domestic forms today, while the Bos primigenius of Europe actually is somewhat different. In the Zebu itself, you have different forms, different haplogroups, a Z1 and a Z2, which later on you'll see is an I1 and I2 for indicus as opposed to Zebu. And this seems to indicate that there may have been more than one locus of domestication of these animals, probably within South Asia, although there is now some alternative ideas about why this may be taking place, which I'll talk about a little later. Here is another graph showing the genetic situation with Zebu cattle. You can see in this one that you have the I1 and I2, I1, I2A, and I2 there, basically. And you can see that you have individuals in these different areas, northwestern South Asia, southern South Asia, eastern South Asia, and central South Asia, which are different populations are having differing amounts of genetic material from these three different forms. And you can also see here, in a much broader extent, that these animals are also found in China, as well as over in the Middle East, and of course, which is not on in this map, you have some in Italy as well. Of course, the source of your mozzarella, your really good mozzarella. So, and you also they're found in Australia and in South America as well. So, of course, humans have transported these animals across vast expanses, not only of land, but of water. And this is one thing which is really interesting to study, because it's now becoming increasingly clear that animals are transported very early, and not just small animals. Also, very large animals were being transported, even as early as the early Neolithic, and in fact, in the case of pigs, as early as the late Epipaleolithic or late Paleolithic, where they were transported from the mainland of Western Asia onto the island of Cyprus. And later on, even very large animals were transported onto Cyprus as early as about 8,000 BC or even earlier. So we've vastly underestimated the ability of humans to transport materials not only overland but across marine, fairly significant marine areas. And this can only be, of course, confirmed by the fact that you have individual humans reaching Australia at least by 45,000 years ago, and they had to do at least part of that by boat. So human relationships with maritime situations is very ancient. This lower graph here, this lower picture here basically shows you, based on the archaeological evidence, our indication of where you had the original possibly domestication in this region and northwestern portion of South Asia, and how it may have spread to the south and eventually to the east. So much of the work which this is based on is work that I've done over the last 20 or 25 years, and also work that Ajita Patel has done down here in the Gujarat area over the last 10 or 15 years. And we'll look at some of the evidence which relates to that aspect. Now, in the northeastern portion where I did my early work, we have actual evidence in the form of clay figurines of humped cattle. And these date to at least 5,500 BC, and are particularly physical evidence for the hump, which otherwise is not preserved in the archaeological record. You don't see the hump in the osteology, although there are some differences in the nature of the vertebral column, which can, if they are present, indicate you're dealing with a Zebu cattle. And differentiation osteologically between Zebu and non-Zebu cattle is actually a very difficult undertaking, and is something which we have been working on trying to aid future researchers to be able to carry out. It would be a lot easier if we were able to recover ancient DNA or ancient proteins from the bones from this particular region of the world, but that is something which is, to date, has not been possible because of the nature of the environment in which this, and the particular deposits in which this material is found. Evidence for the local domestication of Zebu cattle in northwestern South Asia at the site of Mehrgarh basically comes from different lines of evidence, two of which are, one of which is shown here, which is basically a size decrease through time from extremely large animals up at in the earliest levels, and increasingly smaller animals as you go down. So by the time you get down here, you have very few large animals, whereas in the earliest levels you have a large proportion of the populations being large animals. And this is over a period, this decrease is marked over this period down to 5,500 and continues down even later. This is not atypical in what happens to domestic animals which are kept by humans in less than optimal conditions, and is something which is a characteristic of the process of keeping animals over extended periods of time and isolating them from wild populations. But the isolation of animals from wild populations in areas in which the wild population still existed is something which is increasingly being scrutinized, because it seems that in many forms of animals, in fact, they were not isolated completely from the wild populations, and you had integration, genetic integration from wild populations into domestic forms, indicating that people actually were either letting their domestic animals out, basically, and where they would be able to breed with wild forms, or else they were actually capturing wild animals and bringing them in to their breeding areas and using them to breed with the domestic forms in order to increase variability within those forms, perhaps staving off inbreeding, which otherwise might be the case in forms which were kept very closely in smaller communities. So this is a new frontier for our understanding of the way that people operated with, basically bred animals in the past and kept them, and is something which has been promoted by increasing scrutiny of the both modern and ancient DNA examples that we have available. In the site of Loteshwar, which is located in Gujarat, basically in western portion of India, You have similar sort of evidence from very large animals and very small animals, from even very small sites, which were initially hunting camps used by mobile populations, to campsites for equally mobile pastoral populations. And you see, so you did have wild populations present in the earlier levels, and these were replaced later on by domestic populations, pastoral populations using the same areas. There are, so far, no basic sites which actually show a continuity between the earlier hunter-gatherers and the later pastoralists. Because of the nature of the way people occupied that area, which was on a seasonal basis, because of the nature of the rainfall and regimes and the available water regimes in those areas. Now, looking at China to the east, you also, as indicated earlier, you also have Zebu. And what's particularly interesting is that the Zebu animals today dominate particularly southern China, and they are less common in the northern and the northwestern part of China, although as you can see by the black areas on these circles, you still do have some Zebu contribution to the genetic stock of those areas. These are modern animals, and you can see here basically the line which is drawn here, which is through the Jingling Mountain area, basically which separates North China from South China, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, is that correct? And so this is sort of like a boundary between those two. And the outstanding question is, if Zebu cattle were domesticated in South Asia, as the evidence seemed to indicate currently, although of course I must say that our evidence for the rest of South Asia and Southeast Asia is not robust, but this is a working hypothesis. How would the Zebu have arrived in China, and when did they arrive in China? And what basically did their arrival in China mean as far as the way animals were being utilized in China? These are all interesting questions. They're questions which have not yet even begun to be answered, but we're making a stab at it. At which point, of course, what we have here in a grave from the Han period in Gansu area of southern China, near to the area where you have the border with Laos and Vietnam, in that area down there. You actually have a series of Han period graves, where in one grave you have the Taurine cattle and the Zebu cattle, these bronze figures together in the same grave, indicating at least by that time both animals were actually known in this part of southern China. So it actually gives us a useful date which we can perhaps work back from, and people can start to investigate from that period back. But the Han period was a period of a vast expansion across China and increasing trading across vast areas and movement of populations. Later, just after the Han period, of course, you have the arrival of Buddhism in China, indicating connections with South Asia. You also had the spread of Hinduism into Southeast Asia and what have you, maybe somewhat earlier even. And these all are factors in the relationships between peoples across this area, and not only by land, but also maritime relationships are things which need to be investigated and which are stimulated now by some of what these findings are as far as the Zebu is concerned, but even more so as far as the water buffalo is concerned. Here's a wild water buffalo on the left. This is the proposed ancient distribution of wild water buffalo with the areas hatched, which are areas where you still can find wild water buffalo, or what are called feral water buffalo today. In other words, wild buffalo which were kept by humans, but then basically fled out into the wilderness and acclimated themselves to living in the wild. And distinguishing between these is sometimes possible, but not always, and really the only way you can do it in an accurate way is actually doing it by genetics, and the genetics of water buffalo is rather understudied at the moment, although that is changing also. So you have this vast area here, which is reflected in the archaeological record from northwestern South Asia, across all of South Asia, Southeast Asia, even into island Southeast Asia, and then across China, southern China, all the way up into northern China, reflected in the archaeological and also in the paleontological records. Okay, this is Jita Patel for scale. You can see these are extremely large wild water buffalo from India, which are in the collections of the Museum of Comparative Zoology. You can see the variability in the morphology of their massive armatures, and making them, and you can imagine these animals are not only living out in the open areas, but they're also living in forest areas. And you saw on the original one, getting these armatures through the forest is probably not a trivial pursuit. Of course, they can also be using as diving boards, in Vietnam. Also, for both water buffalo and cattle, they also could be ridden. And this is something which is underappreciated, because we often think of cattle and water buffalo as pulling something, as being traction animals, pulling carts or plows or what have you. But in fact, they could be ridden and they could be beasts of burden. So before the horse and donkey came along, or the camel, these were probably your beasts of burden. They would allow goods to be moved over areas as well as populations, and they're still used today in parts of Pakistan in transhumance to go from the lowlands of eastern Balochistan to the highlands of central Balochistan with the seasons, and they actually have their goods, either they have them in big trucks or they have it on the backs of cattle. Of course, if you're going to take cattle up with you, might as well use them for something, including babies and chickens especially. Now, going back at least 4,200 BC, you actually have good horn remains of these cattle with the broad sweeping horns, again from the site of Mergar, and even earlier remains from water buffalo from the site. Notice the shape of that horn. It's very similar to all the ones you've seen so far. You also, at the site down near to the site of Loteshwar, which you saw earlier, there's another site called Santli, and at that site you actually have whole skeletons of water buffalo dating to between about 7,500 and 5,500 BC. These are clearly wild animals in very poor state of preservation. But again, you can see the shape of their particular armatures. Again, the very large sweeping ones. At the site of Dolavira, later, dating about between about 2,500 and 2,000 BC, you have very high proportions of both cattle and water buffalo remains, the water buffalo in red, in an area which is actually gets reliable rainfall maybe once every 5 years. Water buffalo you consider to relate to water, and that's, of course they are related to water, so you have to do something to get them water. And so one thing which feature of this site was it actually was a huge site for the harvesting of water, and they had huge reservoirs around, so when it rained torrentially, like it did in Boston sometimes this summer, basically all the water would be directed into these reservoirs, and they would basically be a source of sustenance for both the population and for the animals. Now, I point out you have this particular horn shape, which all the ones I've showed you before, but also in western India and Pakistan you have this particular horn shape, which is very curled. These animals are used for milk, not for traction. And these animals have a rather different genetic signature than the ones which have these, generally speaking. Here is a genetic starburst. These are Chinese buffalo, basically, in the red and the blue. This is one form of Chinese so-called swamp buffalo. That's the form with the sweeping horns. And these are the second lineage of swamp buffalo. These are the river buffalo, which are quite somewhat different genetically from either of these two. And then this is the outgroup is cattle. So there is a significant genetic difference. Now, as far as the history of water buffalo, speaking of the written history or the illustrated history in China is concerned, these animals are closely affiliated with the preparation of paddies for growing rice. And this was something which was thought to be the case even earlier in China in the Neolithic. However, this seems to be no longer the case. Because there is no, Li Lu and Chen Chen-san have done extensive historical research on this, and there is no solid evidence for the actual use of these animals as a source of attraction very, very early on, although they are represented on bronzes, for example, on these Shang bronze here, And basically, what's important here is that the morphology of the horns you see is quite different from those of the ones I've showed you. They're neither curled nor are they very long. And you can see again here the difference. You can see clearly on the upper one here are the early Chinese ones, and down here are the modern and the ancient ones. Sorry, the two modern ones, and the old but not the Indian form down here. So excavations by Liu Lu back when she did her dissertation here, basically at the site of Kanja in northern China, produced a number of buffalo bones from which it was actually possible to get ancient DNA. And this is the results of the DNA research by Dongyun Da from Simon Fraser University. And you can see that there is these animals from the site of Kanja basically are actually as different as from the river and from the swamp as the river and swamp are from each other. So you're dealing with a third form of water buffalo here. A form of water buffalo which is now extinct in China. When it went extinct is an interesting question. During the Shang period and thereafter, there was a lot of hunting going on, royal hunting and what have you. And it could be that over that period of time, and also competition for resources. In other words, water buffalo could be quite create serious damage in fields and what have you. They may have been hunted out. There may have been relic groups left, but we don't know that yet. Hopefully, we'll find some evidence for those. And of course, you have this wonderful image of the very happy-looking water buffalo figurine from Anyan in bronze, basically, just as a suggestion of the fact that this animal, as well as cattle, were extremely important in the Shang period as animals of sacrifice. Water buffalo are much less well represented than cattle, but they are definitely represented. And this may be one reason why animals started to became less and less frequent in the wild, was because they were actually being hunted for sacrificial purposes, and which is also similar possibility in northwestern South Asia. As you can see here, this individual spearing this one is clearly probably wild water buffalo on a terracotta tablet from the Indus civilization. So in the end, and I'm sorry this is the last slide, but it was because of problems with interfaces with PCs and Macs, I didn't get the text in there. So you have basically early water buffalo and cattle here. You have much later ones in Thailand area, in Southeast Asia, and Eastern India, and you have the situation in China. So you have these three distinct areas, which probably aren't so distinct in the past. What we need to look at now is the relationships between these areas through time, and look at the forces, the historical forces, the human forces which led to the movement and transfer of animals, along with them, of course, people, ideas, and ways of doing things through these vast areas which formed the foundations for the domestic economies which developed in these regions. Thank you very much.
We'll take one question and then move to our last talk. Right here.
Go ahead, Ken. Richard, when you were describing the correlation between diminishing size and domestication, you said something like that's not atypical of situations where animals are maintained in less than optimal conditions, but I would have thought that people would be selecting for smaller and more manageable animals.
That's another aspect of it as well, but at the same, it's probably a combination of both things, and thank you for bringing that up. Selecting for smaller animals may have been present because of the fact that smaller animals have a tendency to be, they basically can survive better on less rich diets. Basically, they take less food overall, and therefore you can have more of them. You spread the risk more by having smaller animals. So that is definitely another aspect of things. Yes.